This is the Books Podcast presented by Tim Haig.
You can't derive an ought from an is. Noam Chomsky being taken out of a university auditorium in a stretcher, having just been destroyed by Ben Shapiro.
I ask you, gentlemen of the jury, is this the kind of book you'd like your wives and servants to read?
I think we've all had knockdown, drag-out arguments with political opponents, people who don't agree with us. Sometimes we win, sometimes we don't win so much. And in front of me I have a book called Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left by Ben Burgis, who is joining me via Skype from New Jersey. Hello, Ben.
Hello.
Thank you for joining us. Is your case that the right uses logic, or at least the idea of logic, as its property, and that the left allows itself to be bamboozled? Really, is that where you're coming from?
In a way, yes. I think that a lot of people on the right, certainly here in the United States, like to talk a lot about logic and to sort of use it rhetorically as a way to differentiate themselves from the left. That, the sort of implication is that they're hard-headed and coming to conclusions based on facts and logic, whereas people who disagree with them are just relying on their feelings, right? So Ben Shapiro, for example, is famous for using the catchphrase "facts don't care about your feelings," where the implication is that he's basing his conclusions politically on facts, whereas people who disagree with him are just, disagreeing because of their emotional reactions. And I think that there's, without exaggerating it, because of course there are plenty of people who are on my side, who are on the left, who make good and rigorous arguments for their positions. I do see a bit of an overreaction in some quarters to the Ben Shapiro types, where
let's talk about him then, because he's a bit of a bête noire for you. You single him out not because he's the only or the most prominent, but he's a perfect example of this phenomenon for you, and you deal with him quite a lot in the book. So we actually are beginning to hear about him in Britain too. But can you just sketch who is Ben Shapiro?
I saw the BBC interview. That was interesting. He sort of started as a conservative, wunderkind. He was maybe 19 when he started doing his column, and he's a conservative commentator who's an Orthodox Jew. He's one of the main figures in what's sometimes referred to as the intellectual dark web, which is a group of right-wing thinkers and commentators that include people like Jordan Peterson, Brett Weinstein, and the reason to kind of talk about Shapiro as much as I do is that he's kind of the poster boy for the rhetorical strategy that I started out talking about.
Well, of course, he wrote a book called How to Debate Leftists and Destroy Them, 11 Rules for Winning the Argument, which is and he's, in a way, it's a mirror image then of your approach, isn't it? He likes to be seen as the destroyer of weak arguments.
Yeah, so that's quite a title, right? That's sort of
it really is.
Imagine, like Noam Chomsky being taken out of a university auditorium in a stretcher, having just been destroyed by Ben Shapiro. One difference between the two approaches is that, so Shapiro, what he does is typically, of course, he doesn't go around arguing with people like Noam Chomsky. What he does is he goes and he'll give a talk on a college campus, and in Q&A, there'll be some somewhat confused left-wing 19-year-old who will ask him a question, challenge him in the Q&A, and then he will, talking loud and fast and confidently as he does, he'll bulldoze over them, and then it'll become a YouTube clip called, Ben Shapiro destroys another liberal on college campus. And,
well, now that raises but does not beg the question. as you,
Very good, yes.
Yeah, well, you instructed me in the book. That raises the question, though, with Ben Shapiro, whether we're talking about deploying logic, or whether we're deploying the sophistry, the tricks of argument. And you suggest that Ben Shapiro is much more adept, really, at bulldozing than reasoning.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's related to the point about destroying, because people are so used to that language. I'm fairly sure I've been in videos that people have labeled, like that. But I think it's a really bad metaphor for how to think about what arguments are for. Well, that the purpose of reasoning is to try to get things right. And if you're, the purpose of reasoning isn't to make your opponent look bad, right? Which is what people are talking about more or less when they talk about destroying. And Ben Shapiro is a really instructive example, because he will more or less constantly set up these false dilemmas that, either you support everything the Israeli government does or you support Hamas, and the reason that he gets away with that is because he does these things that are rhetorically effective. And there's nothing wrong with trying to be rhetorically effective. Rhetoric is, logic and rhetoric are both valuable things, but oftentimes it could disguise deficiencies in the argument. That, if he slowed down a little bit, if he gave the 19-year-old snowflake a chance to respond and, to sort of collect her thoughts before he responded to her, then people might start to notice, oh no, there really are more options than that, aren't there? Right? Like you are, like you sound very confident, you're talking quickly, you're talking loudly, but are those really the only two options?
But all that said, you write in your book, don't mistake this book, yours, as a plea for civility. You're not, for instance, saying that if the left argued their case with flawless logic, the right would accept it. There is a point of having the argument. And again, you say the purpose of winning arguments is not just to feel better about ourselves. So actually, I made notes in the margin as I was going along, and I kept using the word "or," whether this was about debate or polemic. Whether the book is philosophical or political, and whether, and this was where I ended up, is it a manifesto or a manual, your book?
I think the answer to all three of those questions is both, because the book certainly makes an argument that people on the left should be more concerned with learning about logical fallacies, for example, ways that arguments can go wrong, and not just sort of treating them as if there were these kinds of, prescient arbitrary conventions for how to, have a civilized debate. But like, these are ways that we can reason badly and we can reason better if we can avoid them. And these are things that we should take more of an interest in, that we should be trying harder to learn the art of our argument. And so I give an argument about why we should care about these things, but it is also intended as a manual, that as like the part of the intention of the book is that people, having finished reading it, will actually have some tools for making better arguments in a variety of contexts, including both debates and polemics, and so I believe I may have missed one of your questions, but I believe that the answer to all of them is both.
Well, I want to know, though, I want to pin you down. Would you rather have effective reasoning, or would you rather win the argument in the end? Because I'm going to out you at this point.
Sure,
firstly, you're a professor of philosophy. And you're a Marxist as well, and you have very strong views about the urgency of overthrowing capitalism. So it's not a dry academic question, and it's not even a question of just feeling better about ourselves because we did better in the argument. For you, there is an agenda as well, isn't there?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think so. So yeah, no, this is very true. I'm not a I'm not a neutral participant, observer. When I teach a philosophy class, of course, in that role, a lot of what I do is to try to, get people to see the other sides of questions, even when I agree with them, and I sort of, I like it when students later express surprise about finding out what my actual views are. But of course, that's not the context here at all, right? Like I'm very concerned with one of the reasons to write something like this, one of the reasons to try to give people this sort of manual, and one of the reasons to sort of urge people to take these tools more seriously is that I do have political goals that I care very much about, both short-term social democratic goals and more radical ones, and I care about achieving them. And I think that, and whereas I'm under no illusion, as you said, that just making perfect arguments would be enough to achieve them, right? There is no moral argument that you can give Jeff Bezos that will convince him to to give up his billions or even improve conditions at the Amazon
warehouse. You've got to divorce him for that.
Yeah, right. So that's the best way to get him to give up some of them. But yet another union that Jeff Bezos has busted. But
that was very good.
But yeah, I think that it's, even though just making really good arguments certainly isn't enough, right? It doesn't substitute for organizing that union at the Amazon warehouse. It doesn't substitute for winning elections, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It is a tool that can persuade people. And so, of course, if I thought that you could, that you could like trick people by making very bad arguments, and that you could, you can get people to be socialists that way. And if you could do that for enough people that, that would actually be effective, that would be something of a moral dilemma because, as you say, there are urgent things at stake. But I tend to think that if we think we're in that moral dilemma, that's because we're overestimating our devious powers of persuasion. I think that especially in the kind of media landscape that people are in, where they're saturated with information, they have access to lots of other people making lots of other arguments besides us. The idea that if we're like clever and devious enough, we can make misleading arguments and win, so this dilemma will come up in the first place is probably a little self-aggrandizing. I think our best bet is actually to make good arguments.
Okay, well, in that case, can we, as it were, get under the bonnet a little bit? Let's go back to Ben Shapiro and his slogan, "Facts don't care about your feelings." How are we going to answer that? What's our approach going to be?
Yeah, so I think that Ben Shapiro, or more accurately, anybody who's taken in by that, would do well to read their David Hume, from which they'd learn that any kind of argument for a normative conclusion, a conclusion about what should happen, what's good, what would be good, what's desirable, can't come from purely factual premises. That's called Hume's law, that you can't derive an ought from it is. So anytime you're coming to a certain moral or political conclusion, there's always going to be some sort of non-factual value premise that's doing crucial work in that argument.
And of course, outcomes are facts as well, aren't they? That's when they talk about facts, don't care about your feelings. They only want to take one set of the facts into account.
Yeah, I mean, you can always, emphasizing different facts can suggest different conclusions. But the methodological point that is really important to stress here is that no matter which facts, you're emphasizing, whether you're talking about, the fact that a day-old zygote is biologically human and alive, which isn't really controversial or interesting, or whether the fact that you're emphasizing is that some study estimates that such and such many women would die in botched abortions if there were no legal abortions. Those, which one of those things you're emphasizing might certainly suggest a different conclusion. But if you're actually interested in reasoning about this, okay, in light of all of this, what position should we take? Then you have to have some moral principles about whether fetuses are the right kinds of entities to have a right to life at all. If they are the kinds of entities that have a right to life, how does that right line up against a pregnant woman's right to bodily autonomy? And people, it's not that there's that you couldn't have an interesting discussion about this between two people who, came to different conclusions in good faith, but just sort of say that, oh, my position follows from science is...
The right does this with economics as well, don't they? They like to position themselves as not having a stake in it. It's just the way things are. And when the left critiques it, then the left is somehow going against natural law.
Yeah, right. That you just must not understand economics, which of course is often. Part of the problem here has to do with the epistemic defects of economics as a discipline, because quite a bit of it is fairly like on the face of it, right? If you've never taken an economics class, but you knew a fair amount about everything else, and you were just going to guess what would go on in economics as an academic discipline, you'd think, oh, well, so this is the branch of social science where we empirically study how economies work. That sounds right. But in practice, quite a bit of economics is not like that. Quite a bit of economics is extremely idealized and a priori. That we sort of imagine how perfectly rational agents would interact in certain kinds of simplified market environments, and some models that you can construct that way do have some predictive power, but it's not a coincidence that people that conservatives and libertarians tend to gravitate towards ones that produce conclusions that are amenable to them ideologically. And it's also very telling that one of my favorite examples of this is about minimum wage research. That a common argument along the lines of what you're saying is that we can't raise the minimum wage to something that people can live on, because if we did so, that would raise unemployment. And this is generally glossed by saying that it would help it would hurt the very people it's intended to help. That even if you accepted the premise, there is a value judgment that's smuggled in here that's often not obvious. Because even if it were true that minimum wage increases would lead to some increase in unemployment, it wouldn't follow at all that therefore this was a net negative. Because
Hume's law, you can't get from is to ought.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, you have to, the premise that you need there is that the only factor that we should care about is employment. And at that point, you start to get suspicious, because employment tends to track, economic growth and profits and things like that. And so say, are we really concerned with the effects on the working poor, or are we interested in something else here? Because if you're really concerned primarily with effects on the working poor, then you'd have to look at a bunch of effects besides employment. Like you'd have to say, okay, if some people, for the sake of argument, lose their jobs, we have to balance that against the effects on all the people who don't lose their jobs. And in fact, there is quite a bit of empirical evidence that minimum wage increases actually increase life expectancy for a variety of reasons. In countries, for example, that don't have socialized healthcare, people are slightly more likely to be able to see the doctor. Reducing economic stress makes people less likely to smoke, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so if you have, plus, of course, people who advocate higher minimum wages tend to also advocate various social programs to make it not as bad to be unemployed temporarily. So it might sound nitpicky, but it's a very revealingly incomplete argument. When you sort of jump straight from the premise, which turns out to be false anyway, but the premise that minimum wage increases would increase unemployment, to the conclusion that therefore they're bad, as if there was absolutely nothing that we should care about in this picture besides exactly what the employment rate is.
Can I bring you back to your book for one final question? Can you tell me, what do you think are the most egregious sins committed by both sides? One or two, perhaps, each for the right and left in this field of arguing and sophistry.
Yes. So I think that one of the most egregious sins that's committed argumentatively on the left is about standpoint epistemology, which is the sin committed when we treat the demographic facts about the person who's making an argument as if they were relevant to an extent that they're really not. That you should just listen to, maybe if you have a privileged position, instead of criticizing things or disagreeing with things said by those less privileged, then you should just sort of defer to them, which I think is a very bad idea, both because a lot of persuadable people will realize that this just doesn't really make very much sense, and also because this is something that can all too easily be weaponized and picked up by the other side. So, for example, somebody could say, "Hey, you, a Gentile, are defending Jeremy Corbyn against accusations of anti-Semitism. Why don't you just, be quiet and defer to the lived experiences of people who are making these accusations?" As far as the right goes, one that I didn't mention, but is an interesting example, is the continuum fallacy, which is the mistake that we make logically when we infer from the fact that there's a spectrum and there are gray areas, and it's very hard to tell exactly where the line is crossed between one category and another category, to the conclusion that there just isn't a real distinction. So it's, I think, fairly straightforward how this applies in the abortion debate about when a fetus becomes a person. And I think that you generally tend to know that you're in the presence of this fallacy when you hear people say, "Oh, but if you don't agree with me about this, where do you draw the line?"
Ah, yes, the draw the line thing, when it's fuzzy. Well, Ben, thank you very much. The book is Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left. It's published by Zero Books. It was written by Ben Burgis, of course, and it's available $10.99 in Britain, $16.95 in America. Very interesting. Thank you very much, Ben.
Thank you.
That was the Books Podcast with Tim Haig. The Books Podcast is produced by Green Shoot. You can find out more at www.green-shoot.com, and Tim can be contacted on tim@green-shoot.com.